Hello, and welcome to episode 40 of What If Civilization Started Over. Episode 40, of course, will take us into 1940, as in December of 1939, France began their invasion of Italy, which led to all of the communists declaring war on them, and then the fascists declaring war on the communists, and now we've got a massive war on our hands. So I'm going to do the same thing I did for World War One, where I color the communists in red and the fascists. I'm going to actually color them in brown. I think it's going to make the war look a little bit better. And I'm going to color the neutral nations in gray. So let me go do that, and then we can get the war on for real. Okay, I believe I have everyone involved now. I even included the American front of the war, since this is blending into the American Civil War, with the U.S. kind of playing a third party, not really liking the communists or the fascists. But yeah, this didn't actually happen in the last episode, but yeah, obviously the communists, or the fascists, all gang up together as soon as the communists do the same. So that is why this is what the front looks like. And I just realized that these teams are looking starkly similar to real-life World War I, so we'll see how it ends up going. But the French invasion of Italy is the main event of the war for the first month or two, as there's kind of a phony war going on in all the other fronts, as they're all gearing up for war, while France manages to capture Corsica and Elba, and is slowly pushing their way down the Italian coast. Andalusia is remaining staunchly neutral, which means that aid can go through the Mediterranean, but if France manages to capture the Balearic Islands or Sardinia, that can be a lot harder for Italy to receive aid, especially if they can also cut off the Adriatic. That's the reason that Greece is such an important country to keep neutral. But anyway, Russia is invading through the Caucasus Mountains into Turkey and Mesopotamia, but they're not doing a very good job at it, which is kind of embarrassing for them because they were really strong. They're getting help from Afghanistan, which is helping, but Afghanistan wasn't actually as strong as they might have seemed at first. It's just they were fighting against much weaker countries in general. And so these three countries together, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Russia, are not really even being able to push in to Turkey and Mesopotamia, which is kind of embarrassing, especially because Poland is absolutely getting destroyed by Western Poland, who is in a military alliance with Belgium. So even though they're not technically communists, they're on the communist side of the war. And of course, with Belgium, who is getting invaded into by France, as France has inadvertently started a two-front war for them. But they're not really focused on this front, as they're focused on kicking Italy out of the war as soon as possible, which seems like it might actually happen. However, Croatia is focusing on the Romanian front, which they might be having Greek support in, just because Greece is completely surrounded by the communists, and they're really afraid of being invaded by the communists. So for now, they're going along, even though they actually have fascist sympathies, more so than communist sympathies. And so with Turkish help as well, the Russians are getting kicked out of Romania, where they took refuge for like one episode. When the capital of Poland is captured, this is really bad for the fascists, but things are going better for them on other fronts. For example, on the American front, with help from the other fascists, the Canadian fascists are beginning to advance into the communists. And basically the rest of the fascists, including Texas, is like, let's not deal with the communists. Let's not deal with the U.S. right now. Let's deal with the communists, as Texas will stop aiding these communist rebels over here, allowing for the U.S. to start taking these areas back. And when I said communist, I meant fascist. California also has a similar thing where they stopped helping the American communists, which means the U.S. is actually doing decently well because of this war, even taking back this city. However, the entire communist pocket here is taken, and with it, the entire American communist movement is only relegated to the pockets in the West, as the fascists here ignore orders from the other fascists to play a more supportive role and start going for the capital of the U.S., because if they can convert the whole U.S. to fascism, that would be a major victory in the war. There is a slight problem, which is that the Yucatan country is absolutely suffering. They are actually very powerful for their size, but they don't have very many cities. I think there's one that didn't make it onto the war map. But like they don't have very many people. And Mexico is really powerful, and Honduras on their own is enough to beat these guys. And in fact, Mexico's barely helping Honduras. So Yucatan is actually subsumed pretty quickly, but they're annoying as heck to occupy. And it allows for Texas to start sending their troops down into Mexico until they get to the populated parts where they start suffering, while California is kind of letting the U.S. Deal a little bit of damage in the west in exchange for being able to deal damage to Texas in the east or in the south. Over in the Americas, it's a completely different story, as Bolivia is completely outmatched by the Brazilian communists, who start invading into Bolivia until they get to a defending line that Bolivia had fortified over here. And in other lines, they're not able to get that far because the Bolivian fascists are like ultra military minded compared to other people. And they were actually really good at preparing for a communist invasion. So for now, Brazil is not going to be able to defeat Bolivia, but they are also not going to be able to beat Bolivia. They're not going to be able to be invaded by Bolivia. Over here on this western front, India is invading into Afghanistan, but they're mostly just liberating Pakistan, which is why it's going so easily for them, as a lot of the armies here were Pakistani conscripts with like Afghan leaders, but Pakistani like privates and stuff. And so a bunch of mutinies happen in the Pakistani region that leads to Afghanistan losing control of the region pretty quickly. As India will start pushing up. However, they really slow down once they get to Tibet, and it just doesn't work. As Afghanistan is able to fortify this border and continue their slow but sure push into Mesopotamia, which is so densely populated that Mesopotamians are hearing horror story after horror story, as a few cities are going to get wiped off the map, although they're going to be rebuilt because I don't feel like erasing them. Actually, no, yeah, there's one city slayer. Yeah, no, they're going to get wiped off the map permanently. And Mesopotamia is going to be very badly demolished by this. Persia is being begged by both sides to join, but they're obviously going to opt for now to stay neutral. However, Mesopotamia is very badly suffering, and when they get cut off from Turkey, that's really bad for them, because even though Russia is glacially slow at this war, they're doing it in such a way that hopefully they're just going to eventually win by brute force, as the front line in the east has started to stall, which is very bad for the communists, and Rome is now surrounded. The official government of Italy has moved to be located in Sardinia, or not Sardinia, but that's Sicily, because they're kind of scared of Rome being captured, but they're still going to continue to defend Rome as if it were the capital, because it's by far their biggest city. And they even managed to push back against the fascists a decent amount, while France is struggling to push into Belgium. While this entire war is going on, we're going to go back to the original layer for a quick second, as Japan is doing their own little side quest in which they invade into this Chinese warlord, and this other Chinese warlord will help Japan with this invasion, and the Chinese fascists will also help, as the warlord will surrender specifically to the other Chinese warlord, but these guys had already agreed on how it's going to be divided up, because the warlords are much more aligned with the fascists than the communists. Asia, or at least East Asia, is managing to stay pretty much completely out of this war. These colonies are no longer Belgian. These are no longer Belgian colonies. But East Asia is managing to stay mostly out of this war, but Japan did manage to take advantage of the war to expand their own sphere of influence, and they might be planning on doing that again soon. Okay, let's go back to the real war, though. And we'll go back to the American front, and I guess I'll just keep doing these fronts in order. Because the Canadian fascists are extremely efficient at this whole war business. They continue to capture American cities, and the American people are seeing this, and they're seeing how their government is sucking at actually fighting back, except in the Texan front, where Texas is getting defeated by 3 sides, and they're kind of feeling kind of squeezed out, but they're continuing to fight. But whenever they go, like, for example, they go fight on the American front, then the Californians and the Mexicans manage to block them off from the West Coast. Then they go fight on the Californian front, they take back a city. But the Americans and the Mexicans will start closing in on their capital city. And at this point, the Americans and the Communists are pretty much aligned. They're still not aligned, they're still this front, and the Americans are actually winning. But the capital of the U.S. in Florida is getting closer and closer to being taken, and the U.S. is starting to have to withdraw from this front as they're starting to have to use most of their military against the fascists, and they're not even really that successful. But they're too anti-communist to be willing to work with the communists, which is allowing for the fascists in Texas to, like, basically the fascists are able to team on them because the communists aren't able to work with them effectively. But the communists in North America are actually doing decently well. Meanwhile, the Bolivian front is going to remain stalemated with a very little movement for a little while. But finally, in the year 1942, in mid-1941, something will crack. And I think it's like we'll do each pass around is 1 year. So the year is 1940. It was 1940 the first pass around. Now it's 1941. So something will finally crack as Brazilian troops flood into Bolivia and new defensive lines are created extremely desperately all the way in the Peruvian territories of Bolivia, creating a brand new front line by the end of 1941 that is looking very desperate for Bolivia, as it seems the communists might be doing the best in the Americas and doing worse in the other fronts. We're finally going to see a new country joining the war, as Greece has been pressured enough by their neighbors to join the war on the side of the communists, despite being a monarchy. They are not changing their ideology whatsoever, but they do think that fascism will be bad for them, as communism is significantly less expansionist, and also they don't like Russia anymore. And with this will start helping Turkey free themselves, and this is at the start of 1941, while Italy is suffering once again, and a surprise invasion of the Balearic Islands is starting to worsen Italy's chances of keep maintaining their supply lines, as they have to desperately defend Sardinia along with Turkish help. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front is starting to finally flip, as Poland is starting to get freed by their Russian allies, but they realize that they're not so much getting freed as getting occupied by the Russians, and a lot of Poles are confused as to why their fascist glory is not actually giving them glory, but is just making them into Russian puppets. The leader of Poland promises them that this is just a temporary war measure, but a lot of Poles are not buying it. Anyway, Russia and France decide, towards the end of 1941, France decides to abandon Italy and to go for a deal with Russia to try and basically take through the Alpine Mountains and through these two cities to cut Belgium off from the rest of the communists and then deal with them before they deal with the rest, which leaves Russia doing less on this front, and the Afghan government just keeps getting embarrassment after embarrassment, as it just turns out they were not even doing that much of the work on this front, which wasn't even going that great for them anyway. It was mostly the Russians, as the communists start making a comeback over here. However, in the 3 months of 1941 that they are doing this plan, it is going very well, capturing this city and getting to the outskirts of this other city. And if they manage to cut off the Belgians from the Croatians, it's pretty much over for the communists, as Belgium is the strongest communist country in the world. India is another one of the strongest communist countries in the world, but they're just having too much trouble actually doing anything because they can't really invade into Tibet, and Persia is being stubbornly neutral. Yeah, India is really struggling. However, in January of 1942, this is like January 10th or something, like early in the month, something interesting will happen. Communist countries that are not in the war will both officially declare war, not on the fascists in general, but on specifically Afghanistan. And joining them will be Tibet and I don't even know. I think they call this country Xinjiang. And these countries were wanting to join in on the war, but not until Tibet and Xinjiang were willing to join. And it took a lot of convincing, but eventually they did get these guys to join. And with Tibet, they have experience in the Himalayas. I guess I'll go backwards for 1942. but they have experience in the Himalayas, and with this, it's very easy for them to start really pushing back fascists, and they're really starting to try and put pressure on the Afghan regime, as Afghanistan was a democracy for such a long period of time, and they were such a stable democracy that a lot of people who were drawn to fascism are no longer into it, and fascism is starting to become kind of shaky in the region. However, this is going to be upended when the two fascist countries in China will join the war in a surprise move, and very swiftly capture the capitals of Xinjiang and one of the dual capitals of the Siberian Union. So the Siberian Union is still going to be fine because they have their other capital, but it is kind of alarming for them. And the Chinese communists are now starting to get encircled, and they lose a bunch of cities really quickly, and the Chinese fascists are doing really well. And India is kind of forced to withdraw back to their border over here and start withdrawing from the Afghan front as Afghanistan makes insane gains in the second half of the year. However, that's not the biggest thing that'll happen this year. Trust me, 1942 is the most important year of the war by far, in terms of turning points. Persia still refuses to join either side. They're hoping they'll just gain from this war on their own. However, the bridge plan between Russia and France fails in the winter as the Alps are just too difficult to actually occupy, or at least this region is, and France decides to fall back. But they don't perfectly communicate that to Russia, who starts to try and help France take the city, not realizing that France has fallen back. However, it's still impressive that even without French help, Russia is able to do this, so it's not really that big of an embarrassment for the fascists. It's just kind of an annoyance. But they don't make that much progress until, or in 1942. But a major event is going to happen. Actually, this is going to happen in November or October of 1942. So let me just do the Mesopotamian front, where Afghanistan is mostly withdrawing, as the communists fully have the edge here and are starting to even invade into this Russian territory that never really wanted to be Russian. But now let's go to the Americas, where a major event is going to happen. And this is a really important event, and it's very bad for the communists, spoiler alert. But the fascists in Canada are going to capture the capital of the U.S. and capture the president. And with that, the entirety of the U.S. will fall to the fascist government. And it's not exactly clear where they decide to draw the border with Texas. But what is clear is the fascists are on the rise and the communists are on the decline in North America. And this happens decently early in the year. California is now starting to crumble under the weight of fascism. The capital of Texas is completely safe. They're able to pressure Cuba into the war so they can have better access to liberate the first fascists in the region, and the second fascist country overall, actually third, which was the Yucatan country. As even though fascism is not an ideology that has a lot of solidarity, they are managing to work together very well, and it seems that communism in the Western Hemisphere might just not be it, as the capital of Honduras is taken and the rest of Honduras will surrender. Things are looking really bad over here. This is where it looks by the end of the year, with the fascists almost having retaken the coast. However, over here, Bolivia is really starting to feel the pressure, and they try and get their former allies to join their side, but the rest of South America desperately wants to stay neutral. And Brazil desperately needs to be able to help their communist allies, so they start a massive push, and they manage to fully force Bolivia to surrender, marking the first full surrender of any country in the war besides these guys. But with this, Brazil is going to start aiding these guys, and a massive event just happened. Actually, it's like a whole series of events. But the main thing is that Andalusia, their monarchy is extremely unpopular. Like, when I say extremely unpopular, I mean, like, if an honest poll were to be conducted in the country, maybe 2% of people would say they support the monarchy, 10% of people would say they don't know if they support it, and then that would be 88% of people disapproving, and of those who disapprove, like 80% strongly disapprove. So it's like very much consensus that the monarchy sucks. but no one really wants to do anything about it because they think communism and fascism are worse. That is until a communist who is really good at public speaking takes power and is tried. And at the beginning of the war, he was sent to prison because Andalusia was fascist aligned, but not fully on board with the fascists. But he was finally released from his prison sentence. It was only a 3-year prison sentence, so he got released at the end of 1942. And as soon as he got released, he had been like writing books and saying stuff like, "When I get released, we're going to revolt all throughout the country, and that's going to be the end of the monarchy." And Andalusia didn't really think that would happen, but it really did happen, as their country kind of has a full-on communist revolution, and they fully join the communist side of the war. However, the monarchy flees to the Andalusian colonies, which I don't really know how to show. And they will actually continue to stay neutral in the war because they think if they join the fascist side, there's like a 0% chance they get control back of Andalusia. So for now, they're just like fleeing somewhere in the colonies, but the colonies are definitely not in support of Andalusia proper. And in fact, Andalusia's puppet state over here in Oman won't even join them. But this is extraordinarily bad for France, as in the last 2 months of 1942, Andalusia manages to not only breach the southern front, but start capturing French cities at an alarming rate. As if we turn off ideologies, Russia is starting to push in to Western Poland, so yeah, Russia's still doing well. In fact, they're like one of the few fascist countries who's still doing well outside of the Americas. But they're kind of stalemated on this front. On this front, things are going really badly as the Siberian Union has very, very, very prematurely surrendered. And this isn't like March 1943, so we're like more than halfway done with the war at this point. But anyway, as I was saying, this is where it looks at the end of 1942. But things are about to get much, much worse for the... Things are going very, very badly for the fascists. Andalusia easily retakes the Balearic Islands and starts a push towards Marseille. France is forced to withdraw mostly entirely from Italy because the occupying force was just too expensive, as Belgium, Croatia, whatever's left of West Poland, although there's not really that much left of it. Basically, everyone is doing a push. Greece is starting to regret joining the war. Russia turns out to be the most competent member of their team. But France is getting close to being forced to surrender, as Brittany is like liberated, you could say. And Belgium starts to push into France. And at this point, things are going really badly. We're about in June or July of 1943. Things are going a little bit better on this front, as the Chinese communists have mostly fallen. And we can actually get a really big rush, as the fascists are managing to push through this empty land extremely efficiently. And India is starting to feel cornered, but they're densely populated enough that they're not going to be taken that easily. And in fact, there's like a massive front line over here, and the fascists are getting really frustrated how well India is holding up. But that might not be the case for long. In 1943, in the Americas, Brazilian aid finally starts to arrive to the communists, which is some much-needed relief as they start managing to push back in this front. However, it's not going to be enough, as Mexico City, which we're just going to call this one Mexico City, even though I think it's more like here, Mexico City is nearly taken, and California loses a bunch of land here. And now we are in July of 1943 all throughout the world. The communists are doing well in Europe, but it seems like things are not going great for them in the rest of the world. And things might be going even worse for them because a massive thing just happened that's going to change the course of the war and kind of determine the course of the war, in a way. England just joined the war on the side of the fascists. They were always leaning towards the fascists. They hated communists. They were willing to do a lot of stuff to get rid of the communists. They set up an anti-communist government in Brazil. I feel like this has been very decently foreshadowed, but England is fascist. They're not fascist. They're still a monarchy. They just want the fascists to win the war because they don't want global communism. And the rest of 1943 is going to be hell for the communists. It's like the worst thing that's ever happened to anyone in 6 months in any war ever. California is completely pushed, and Mexico decides to surrender. And this is just because of the motivation. Like, England is so powerful at this point, and it's also because Brazilian aid might be drying up for whatever reason, as the English colony over here starts pushing in. And the two Brazilian communist countries are starting to bicker, which could be even worse for them if they end up fighting each other. And it seems like the fascists might just win in the Americas by the end of 1944. With a new front in India, things are going very badly because India didn't have that many forces on the British front. They knew that England might join, but they didn't expect them to join this quickly or this thoroughly. And with this, they're starting to lose as Pakistan is completely taken by Afghanistan, and they lose their border with the Andalusian colony as the Andalusian monarchy is staying neutral in the war, but India is starting to fail. England's Egyptian colony is actually taken as the communists are still doing well in one place. However, English aid to Russia is very powerful, especially in the Middle East, where they are managing to push in and almost take the capital of Mesopotamia before being forced to even out the front line a little bit. As the capital of Turkey, which is like near Istanbul, but I wouldn't say it is Istanbul, is taken, and Greece is starting to sort of regret joining this war and considering surrendering, but for now they'll stay in it a little bit longer. France is getting pushed back as Belgium is starting to get invaded, and everything seems to be going wrong for the communists. Italy starts getting invaded again as Russia is working on the bridge plan, and they finally managed to sever Belgium off from the rest of the world. In 1943, an interesting thing is going to happen over here, like just ignoring everything else that's going on in the world. But Japan is going to help the Chinese warlord over here invade into and annex the theocracy, which is weird because there's like a massive war going on and Japan isn't really exercising their influence in this war at all. Instead, they're just doing some local stuff. A lot of the world is confused about why Japan is doing this. But anyway, it is the end of 1943 now, and we're starting to head into 1944. And with American aid to the fascists and the English in South America, the capital of one of the two Brazilian countries gets taken, which is really, really bad for the Brazilian communists. But obviously communists are nothing if not, fighters, so they'll continue to fight on. However, it's not clear how much longer they'll be able to hold on in this world. However, for halfway through 1944, they are actually doing surprisingly well, still managing to hold on to most of their population. India is doing a little bit less well, as by the point of halfway through 1944, they basically just have their capital city, which is almost under siege, and two other cities over here, which this one is also under siege. By halfway through 1944, France has fully pushed Andalusia out of their country and is barely starting to push into Andalusia, although Andalusia is holding up surprisingly well. The front over here in Belgium is doing pretty well, as Belgium is starting to not be able to hold out with a British blockade of them and them being invaded by 3 different countries at once. But the fact that they're still holding on after 6 months shows how strong their resolve is. The last of Russian territory is finally liberated from occupation, as Croatia is getting their capital encircled, and Italy is starting to be invaded again, with Corsica being recaptured. However, the entire Black Sea is so deeply in the control of the fascists that Turkey is forced to withdraw all the way from here, and Mesopotamia is continuing to lose land. Okay, but what's important is that there is one thing that's going well for the communists that might help them win the war, because as England prepares to do a colonial invasion into here, it starts off doing decently, as they are able to do this much, and then the front stops as the soldiers who are conscripted from Africa mutiny and start switching sides to the communists, pushing against the English colonizers and trying to march for their own liberation, as the entire African colony of England, as well as of France, but yeah, the entire African colonies of England and France will start rebelling. This is like not just a small number. This is like in massive waves. One happens over here. One happens over here. A massive one will happen in the French colony. The South African country will officially join the communists in the war, as the communists have accidentally branded themselves as liberators, even though Turkey and Andalusia have colonies. Andalusia does claim their own colonies. But these colonial rebellions are very bad for England, and England really does not have the resources to deal with it, as they are like at full war with Belgium and stuff. And although they're significantly stronger than the communists, it's not like a joke. Like, they do need to use their whole military to make sure that they win. So they just don't have the bandwidth to deal with this. What's even worse is that the Indian colony of England who has their own leader, will begin having its own revolution. And unlike in the colonies, it's not really suppressed at all, as the leader of this of the Indian colony didn't really want to join the war. He's really bad at running the war. In fact, in the latter half of the year 1944, India is actually going back and fighting back, especially against the British Indian colony, because the leader of this colony is trying to negotiate with India to basically sell the entire colony back to India in exchange for his own personal fortune. So he's not like a good person. He's basically trying to get super duper rich. Like, he would basically become the richest person in the world if he manages to do this. But obviously England is gonna like try and fire him. And so he basically decides to build his own anti-colonial army together. This is like a fun thing I decided. I was just gonna have this colony revolt, but I think this is more fun. But basically, the British Indian colony rebels from England, and with India being so popular, the Indian people will revolt against the occupiers, and the occupiers can't really do much about it. And this is happening all across the British Empire, with Indonesia, who has been under English rule for like 500 years at this point, has decided they finally had enough. And the old ruling dynasty of Indonesia that was formerly incorporated as an English colony right after the Berlin Conference will declare their independence from England and their neutrality in the war. And England just doesn't have the resources to deal with it, as they're just kind of forced to watch as their colonies declare independence. The Philippines still stay with England because they don't want to join Indonesia, basically. But they're just kind of forced to watch, and the English people are not really happy with this war, despite the fact that they are objectively winning it. In fact, Belgium doesn't surrender; they just are completely taken. So, like, by the end of 1944, Belgium is completely gone. Croatia's capital has fallen, and the eastern front of the war is falling. But the war is extremely unpopular in England as the year enters 1945, and the English monarchy is looking for a way out. However, it might be a little bit too late, as the Argentinian colony will declare independence as well from the British colony, and very quickly negotiate peace with the Brazilians, handing over a large amount of territory to them to be negotiated after the war, on which Brazilian country gets which of the territory. But this colony had been considering declaring independence for a while. I feel like I've been foreshadowing this pretty well, that England had not great control over all of their colonies. That first of all, that they were fascist sympathizers, but also that they didn't have great control of their colonies. And so even though the main English government is doing decently well in the war, especially in the European front, the communists are doing well in South America, as the Argentinians are not helping the communists necessarily, but the Bolivians are kind of just screwed without England. integrated the Argentinians too much into their structure. South Africa is going on a liberation campaign throughout Africa, connecting themselves up to all these communist guerrillas. They're not communists, they're just anti-fascist guerrillas, as the entire British colony is beginning to fall with help from Turkey and Mesopotamia, as well as South Africa. And the leaders of all the individual British African colonies will all surrender. They were actually loyal to the crown, but they were basically all put at gunpoint and forced to surrender, which marks the official end of the African front. The monarchs of Andalusia have now decided that it's a perfect time to basically say, hey, if you let us be the figureheads of the communist government, we will help the colonies be forced into joining the war so that it'll end more quickly. And we're now in March of 1945, and everyone wants that to happen. So reluctantly, the Andalusian communists will be pressured by their allies into letting this happen, though the Omani puppet will still stay out of the war as they have wrestled their way into full independence. Fascists are looking at this with horror as they see that the fascism around the world is failing, and they are desperate to stay alive. So they actually start negotiations with the Andalusian and Indian governments, as Andalusia and India are seen as the leaders of global communism and just the Red Alliance. But they start negotiations with both of these countries so that they can basically stay out of the war. And the communists agree not to support any uprisings or landings in the Americas and kind of leaving the Americas to the fascists. However, things are going really badly for the communists or for the fascists elsewhere, as Mesopotamia is starting to be taken back by March of 1945, or probably May of 1945 at this point. But India is starting to liberate its entire country as well as Pakistan, and at this point, the Afghan leader gets thrown out of a window by his fascist council, who immediately will surrender, which immediately withdraws pretty much the entirety of the occupation of these countries. However, we're going to go to this layer one more time, as Japan will very swiftly start invasions into these two countries before the communists can do anything, and force them both to surrender. And then they will recreate these countries, but they will switch both of their ideologies from fascism. They will switch it to dictatorship, which basically means these guys are puppets of Japan now. These guys are also a puppet of Japan, as Japan has managed to use this war to create their own massive sphere of influence in the region. And the English colony in the Philippines will also be invaded by Japan, and as Japan fully annexes the Philippines into themselves as a colony. And it seems that the world may have forgotten about Japan. But anyway, these guys are officially out of the war because they are under different Japanese puppet governments now. Same with the Filipino colony. The leader of this colony will surrender because, like, what other choice do they have? Same with the leaders of the French colonies over here. France just doesn't have a way to actually supply these guys. And that just leaves Europe, which is still pretty much under firm control of the fascists. But the English government realizes at this point that they should just withdraw from the war. They lost every single one of their colonies without fail. Not a single one of their colonies stayed with them. But they do still have one colony left, and that is Iceland. And the Icelandic people are starting to get a little bit antsy, and England just decides it's not worth it, as they will withdraw from the war. And this might be the most disastrous decision England has made in their history, and really any country has made, because they were the king of the world before this. Honestly, they weren't going to keep on to their holdings for more than a decade anyway. Without Afghanistan in the war, Central Asia is nothing. They were an Afghan puppet through and through as they fall. However, Russia manages to hold on, and they're even still continuing to push. And it's clear to the communists that Russia will not surrender easily, unlike France, It's clear to the communists that Russia and France will not surrender easily. However, in the capital of Andalusia, a new technology is being researched that is called nuclear weapons, and they are considering dropping one on Marseille, I'll call this city, even though it's probably not, or Toulouse or whatever this city is, and one on Moscow, or Kiev. That's not Moscow. And they will drop a bomb, kind of just like a test bomb, just like we're showing you we can do this bomb. They'll drop it on this city here. Actually, they'll drop another one on this city here. And with that, France will surrender, and Russia will start negotiating a conditional surrender, because even though they are getting pushed back on all fronts, everyone knows that it would be a waste of time try to actually invade into Russia fully, as they're actually doing really well, and they're continuing to fight because they want their conditional surrender met. And their conditional surrender is they get to keep all the territories that they had before the war, and they get to annex Poland into them. And they get to keep their government. And for most of the communists, that's too much. But Russia has intelligence that says that they don't have any more nukes. And despite the fact that the communists are pushing back on a lot of fronts, Russia is still being really annoying to them. So they keep saying, hey, we're going to launch another nuke at you. And they will be able to build another nuke by November, but it's already September of 1945. And Russia is starting to hint that they might be getting their own nukes soon. And while most of the communist countries know that's probably not true, they don't really want to risk it. So they agree to accept Russia's conditional surrender. And with that, we have ended World War II. So let's go look at the peace treaty. Okay, I think I'm finally done with the peace deal. That took me like 20 minutes. But North America is entirely fascist except for Canada, which is a monarchist. The Dominican... I left the Bahamas out. The Bahamas are fallen to fascism as well. The DR, which is... or Hispaniola, which is a democracy, and Nicaragua, which is still... in South America, we have Argentina splitting away. Bolivia is forced to become communist, and these two communist countries are mad at each other, but still willing to coexist. The decolonization of Africa goes like this, but it's very much unstable and almost certainly going to change. Also, Eritrea forgot to have an ideology. These are all temporarily democracies, but they're probably going to all elect not democracies. Greece gets their little colony here. France is under occupation. Afghanistan's forced to become communist, which always works out. It's always a good idea to force Afghanistan to be an ideology they don't want to be. That always works out. Central Asia is becoming a very, very shaky democracy. Persia gains a ton of land. Mesopotamia gains a very small amount of land, and they're kind of upset by that, but whatever. Russia gets this... Basically, they still expanded from this war because they captured Poland, but they did lose a lot of men, so maybe it's not worth it. Indonesia's independent, Australia's independent, New Zealand is independent. This is a Fijian country that was always there. And of course, Japan has grown their sphere of influence, and these guys have gotten their old territory back that they sold to Afghanistan in the last episode. And look at the bigger picture. What does the world look like? Well, despite how it looks, there are really this is not a world that resembles the world of our timeline after World War II, where there were two major superpowers. This is a multipolar world. New York, which is the new American country, Russia, Japan, India, Andalusia, and even a few smaller countries like Argentina or South Africa all have their own spheres of influence, which could mean that this multipolar world could end up very unstable as we go into the final era. This series will end on episode 50. But with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!